And now we have Amy, and Amy's talk is No Such Thing. We like having Amy come because she always gives us something to really think about. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Laura Joy, and thank you, Betty, for that presentation that fits in very well with what I will be talking about this evening with my talk called No Such Thing. And I also want to thank John for having me here this evening and asking me to speak. I really enjoy coming here and speaking to the group because I feel that I have been receiving wonderful messages, and I want to share them with other people that I believe have had similar experiences. So coming up here, whenever I talk, you give back to me responses that indicate that, yeah, that's happened to me, that does happen, and I feel very privileged to be able to present some information that I think helps us all move forward and have a wonderful experience. And tonight, I know that I have already spoken about some of these things. I once again want to talk about the spiritual view being the positive perspective versus the human view, which is a negative perspective. And I say that I've said these things before, but Spirit just keeps giving me these same messages. I mean, they keep, every time I get a message from Spirit, it starts with the same thing and it revolves around the same concept of the spiritual view. The spiritual view, the spiritual view. And what the spiritual view is for me, and what they're telling me it is when we synchronize with God and we view life from the spiritual perspective, it opens us up to receive God's grace, and then life becomes better and easier for us. Tonight's talk will begin with a brief discussion of the spiritual view versus the human view, and how to create your own reality through the spiritual perspective. New material for this evening fits in with Betty's talk and what she said this evening from Master Hamid Bey's material. And it will help us to understand and process our emotions of shame, blame, guilt, and fear. I'll wrap things up by sharing several backronyms, which are a fun play on words that confirm to me that we are correct to view life situations from the spiritual perspective. I think it's important to remember that the spiritual perspective has 3 principles to remember. The first principle is that within every situation in life, there are 2 ways to view it. We can view it either positively from the spiritual perspective, or we can view it negatively from the human perspective. The second principle of the spiritual view is the description of those actual 2 views. The human view I see as being negative and of shame, blame, guilt, worry, fear, and doubt. And it is what our logical human mind has conditioned us to believe. Where the spiritual view, on the other hand, is positive. It is always positive. It is of love, light, peace, joy, and happiness. It leaves no room for doubt or judgment or criticism. And it provides us with a universal answers that apply to everything and everyone. And the spiritual view is always uplifting and empowering to you and everyone around you. The third principle of the spiritual perspective is that we are all spiritual beings here to have a human experience, and how important it is to live a balanced life as a spiritual human being. To live as a balanced spiritual human being is to live more from the heart than from the head, and to view everything that happens to us from the spiritual view and believe that divine order has stepped in and what has happened to us is best for our soul's progression. I don't think that we do that on a consistent and regular basis. That we don't always remember that we are spiritual beings here to have a human experience, that we instead fall back into our bodies and our minds and what we have been taught as logic, and what we have been taught as just what we need to accept as life. Rather than standing up and saying, I am a spiritual being here, what is the lesson that I am meant to learn, and how am I meant to apply that moving forward? When we take the three principles of the spiritual perspective, we can put them into action steps and put the spiritual view into practice. I call this creating your own reality through the spiritual perspective. So the three principles transform into action steps that guide us into living as a spiritual being having a human experience. Step one is to acknowledge, first of all, that there are really two ways to view every situation in life. So that's remembering that. That when something good or bad happens to you, that you thank God in spirit for the privilege of learning something new about yourself and about the physical world around you. And that when something not so pleasant happens in your life, that you don't get angry, feel rejected, or experience disappointment. Instead, you look for the lesson that you are meant to learn from the experience happening to you. Step two, in creating your own reality through the spiritual perspective, is to practice aligning yourself with the spiritual view and to begin manifesting your wants, needs, and desires. This means that you remember that God's reality is only one of love, light, peace, joy, and happiness. That the human reality is of the negative things like illness, judgment, criticism, hate, fear, and worry. And that when you align yourself with the spiritual view and God's reality, that is that you stop thinking negatively and viewing everything that happens to you as positive in some way or another. And remembering that you are that spiritual being having a human experience, and that God's view is only of love, light, peace, joy, and happiness. When you align yourself with God's reality, then synchronicity and God's grace begins to happen in your life. Step 3 of creating your own reality through the spiritual perspective is to show gratitude for all that you are, all that you have, and all that you are to become. It is through prayer and meditation, as Betty told us, that every situation that you let God and your spirit guides know that you understand the spiritual purpose for the event happening to you. And you thank God and your spirit guides for the opportunity to learn and to grow and to gain wisdom and knowledge. It is my belief that if you follow these 3 action steps to create your own reality, that you begin to understand the human perspective, and you begin to view every situation from a spiritual view, and you begin to align yourself with God's reality, and you thank God for the opportunity to learn and grow, that this creates a cycle of synchronicity and grace that enhances the human experience through the spiritual view. When you fall into this synchronicity and God's grace, life becomes good and God's grace is felt throughout every aspect of your life. Now you might be asking at this particular point in time why my talk is titled No Such Thing. I believe that we need to have a discussion about our emotions and how we can view life from the spiritual perspective when everything that happens to us has an emotional tie to it. Is there anything that happens in our life that we don't experience some emotion with it, either good or bad, positive or negative? Have you ever thought about that? That there is emotion tied to everything. And when we're trying to view everything from the spiritual perspective, what do we do with the negative feelings and the negative emotions that we happen to feel? I think that we need to understand our emotions and the importance and the purpose that our emotions play within our lives as a human being, and that we need to have a process for dealing with those emotions. How do we handle those emotions, and what do we do with them if they are negative and we're trying to perceive things as positive? What I have come across in my studies, my spiritual studies, is a wonderful book called The Language of Emotions: What Your Feelings Are Trying to Tell You by Carla McLaren. I recommend that everybody on the planet read this book. It's one of those books that everybody needs to read. Now I say that, but I don't know if everybody that reads it would really get as much out of it as I believe this group would get out of it, because the things that Carla, did I say that right? Carla McLaren? Or did I pronounce her name Laura? Anyway, it's Carla McLaren. What she suggests to us in order to understand our emotions and to process our emotions is to do a few things. One is to set boundaries. The second thing is to visualize and burn contracts. The third is to meditate and ask a question, specific question, based on the emotion you're feeling. And then you are to consciously complain, which is always fun. We seem to do that anyway, but we don't realize it or recognize it. And I like that she puts a word to it, a phrase to it, consciously complain. And then we need to ground ourselves. So she has created a process, a full-blown process for processing our emotions. And what's interesting to me is that she also has a process for processing positive emotions like happiness and joy. And it's like I didn't think that I needed that, but after reading this book, we do. We do need that. We need to acknowledge the good feelings and the positive emotions as just as much as we do any negative emotion we may think or feel. What I specifically want to talk about this evening are processing the emotions of shame, blame, guilt, and fear. I mentioned that Carla gives us a process for dealing with those emotions, but what I really have found most helpful myself is to meditate and ask a specific question about a specific emotion. She lists the questions to ask as: who has been hurt when you are dealing with the emotion of shame? What was my intention when you are dealing with the emotion of blame? What has to be made right when you are dealing with feelings of guilt? And what action should be taken when we talk about or have feelings of fear? These are all very powerful feelings. And who in this room has not had those feelings, all of those feelings at any one time, right? Right? And have we not had it happen where we become overcome by those negative feelings and that they consume us? So much so that you can't go on and you can't function in life. Have you had that happen? Where it just, oh my gosh, this feeling of guilt or this feeling of fear or this feeling of shame just overcomes me, and that's all I can think about. It just keeps rattling around in my brain, and I just keep going over it and over it and over it. How do I think about something else? And my talk, the title of my talk is No Such Thing. How do you get to a point where you process the feeling and the emotion and you get it out of your brain to where you can say, there's no such thing as shame. There's no such thing as fear. There's no such thing as blame. Because in reality, those emotions are brought onto us from our logical brain and from what we have been conditioned to believe. If you think about it, as a young child, do we know not to cross the street? No, we don't think of it in terms of it's not a good idea to just cross the street. It isn't until we are taught that there is some danger in doing that that's how we develop fear. So if we think about it, there really is no such thing unless we allow ourselves to think about it that way. I mean, who in this room, would have ever been shamed by walking out of your house naked if we didn't know or weren't told by someone else that you can't do that. Don't do that. That's not a real good thing to do. That's not a good idea to do that. We wouldn't have known that if somebody else hadn't told us that. At some point in time in our life, somebody told us that that's not the kosher, that's not the right thing to do. And at that time, it's quite possible that they shamed you into believing that that's not the thing to do. So how do we get to a point where we do not feel bad about something and get it out of our head? What Carla McLaren proposes is that you meditate on those specific questions or a specific question for a specific emotion that you are feeling. And that when you are able to get the emotion out of your head and you are able to acknowledge that it is all within your mind, it's not necessarily what has happened, but at some point in time it's all within your own mind, then you can say there's no such thing as that emotion. What we need to remember and help us to process the emotions are to remember that they are the gatekeeper of our souls. That emotions do have a purpose. There is something good in emotions. That the emotions have a purpose, and that is to help us to become mature in a conscious and well-regulated person, to help us monitor our behavior, and to help us monitor our spiritual longings, and to monitor our ego. When the healing influences of free-flowing emotions gracefully flow through our psyche, we have a compassionate sense of ethics. That would be the not going out of your house naked. Just for those of you that didn't put that together. And to make sure that you're still awake. And when free-flowing emotions gracefully flow through our psyche, we have a compassionate sense of ethic. We have the courage to judge and supervise our own conduct. And we have the strength to amend our own behaviors. When we successfully navigate through our feelings and emotions, we actually feel proud of ourselves and we move into happiness and contentment. We understand the emotion and we've learned a spiritual lesson and we've mastered the feeling, and we say, and we are able to stand up and say, in my world, there is no such thing as that negative emotion. And I want to ask if anyone here has experienced those things, has experienced happiness and contentment and a feeling of pride when you have mastered an emotion. Have you ever done that? Do you know what I'm talking about? Does that ring a bell? Mm-hmm. I'll tell you a story, my own story of processing shame. A couple of years ago, I was working at the Michigan Works office in Allegan. We were told that a new company was going to purchase the contract for providing the Michigan Works services, and that everyone was going to have to apply for their job with the new company. And we were all going to have to apply an interview with this new company and essentially see if they would reassign us our job. not only was that a unfun, unpleasant task, it was really quite nerve-wracking. You know, were they going to give us our job back and allow us to do the things that we were already doing and we thought we were doing fairly well? Well, what happened in that situation was that everyone else in the office that I worked in was offered their job back by the new company. Everyone except for me.
Oh my God.
Yes, that was what I thought too. It's like, oh my goodness, yes. So many emotions were going through my mind at that time, and I needed to have some way to deal with them. And I had read the book, The Language of Emotions by Carla McLaren, and I took the time to review her process for handling specific emotions. And I'll tell you that I had to go back and reread quite a bit of the book because, you know, I didn't know exactly what my feelings were. Now, I know that that sounds funny, but have you ever been in a situation where you're not quite aware of what it is you're feeling? I mean, that sounds so silly. But I went back and I read the book, and what had occurred to me was that it was actually shame. I was actually embarrassed. I mean, that's what first came to me, was that I was embarrassed that I was the only one that didn't get offered their job back. So the embarrassment then translated to shame, at least in the words of Carla McLaren, it was actually shame. And once I knew that, then I knew that there was a question that I needed to ask myself in a meditative state. And that question was, who has been hurt? Now that seems kind of funny, and I can't really explain why, but it worked. When I was in a meditative state, what came to me was that, you know, I really wasn't a very good employee, and that I really didn't enjoy being there, and that I wasn't at my best, I wasn't at my best game, and that it really wasn't fair to me to work there because there were other people that I worked with that were being hurt. They were coming in on time, they were working hard, they were not complaining to me because I was coming in 5-10 minutes late and I was, you know, just not up to the perfect standards of an employee and that type of thing. And that people really did deserve better. And that I specifically deserved better. I deserved a better position that I enjoyed, that energized me, and that I could be enthusiastic about. But it wasn't until I sat and I meditated on that thought that I realized those things, and I realized that I needed to do something different. And I even at that time had a thought of what that would be and should be for myself. And when I came out of the meditative state, I laughed. I laughed. I have never laughed so hard as when I laughed at that moment. It was like I realized, oh my goodness, this is so right for me to have been fired. Yes, it's funny. It is. It's funny. But I laughed, and it was a good laugh, and it was awesome. And it was also awesome that I felt contentment and happiness for having had the realization and the realization that I needed to have, and that was so right for me at that time. I went the next day back to work, and I was actually glad. I mean, I went in and I handled my last few days there, and I said goodbye to everyone, and I shared what I was going to do when I left that position, and it was a wonderful experience. I encourage everyone to find a process for handling your emotions and to not allow your emotions to just continue to rattle around and revolve around and go around and around and around and drive you crazy. Find that process to handle your emotions and be able to move on and be able to laugh at them and find happiness in the lesson that is meant to be learned from that emotion. All right, I've probably run over a little bit on my time here. The last thing I want to talk about are the backronyms that come along with this particular message. Did everybody receive a little sheet that has their backronyms on them? Now, you may remember that backronyms are a play on words, kind of a fun play on words that show the meaning behind the words. I've been suggesting that we view everything that happens to us from the spiritual perspective. I believe that the negative connotation is the human view of the particular word, and the spiritual view of the word comes out in the form of a backronym. We talked this evening about the emotions shame, blame, guilt, and fear, and the backronyms are here. For shame, shadow human accepting my emotions. Are we familiar with our shadow side? Do we know what that is? Yes? Okay. So shame, the shadow human accepting my emotions. Blame. Blame is being liable and accepting my emotions, or being able to learn and accept my emotions. Of the backronyms this evening, I am sharing, this is my favorite, that is guilt, giving up internal lies and transforming. And if you were to add a Y to that, we could have a backronym for guilty, and that would be giving up internal lies and transforming yourself. And last but not least, there is fear, feeling eager and ready, or what we all have heard, false evidence appearing real. I love these backronyms because they show us so much more of what it is we need to learn when we experience those emotions. And with that, I'm going to wrap up everything by saying, I hope that you will begin to view your life experiences from the spiritual perspective, that you will begin to create your own reality where you are open to receive God's grace, and that you will find a way to process your emotions and be able to stand up and say, in my world, there's no such thing as shame, blame, guilt, or fear, and that you too begin to receive your own meaning and messages from Spirit in the form of backronyms, and that you someday share them with me specifically. So go out now and see how changing your thoughts and changing your perspective changes your life.